This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at the markets. Now, global stock markets ticked up today. We saw emerging markets tracking those global equities climbing higher as well. They were lifted by Sino-US trade optimism after encouraging comments from US President Donald Trump. Now, MSCI's index of developing world stocks was up today, set to end 3 straight weeks of declines. South Africa's JSE did benefit from some of that optimism. It closed the day up 1%. We saw the banking and industrial indices climbing over 1% today. Now, also coming up on the show. Manufacturers in Nigeria are still opposed to the Africa Free Trade Area deal. We find out why. South African Airways goes under business rescue. Will it work out this time? And Tunisian students use technology to help Kenyan sea turtles. Now, manufacturers and several trade organizations have been meeting in Lagos, Nigeria, to discuss their concerns and potential benefits from the Continental Free Trade Area. Nigeria only signed up to the CFTA in July this year, of course, after expressing grave concerns over some aspects of the trade deal. It's also in the middle of a regional trade dispute, having closed its land borders to any trade with its neighbors in ECOWAS. Well, CGTN's Deji Badmus has been following those developments in Lagos and now joins us with the latest. Deji, always good to have you on the show. Now, we're heading closer to the implementation phase of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. This particular forum going on in Lagos seems to seek to address private sector and domestic interests going forward. What were the highlights of the discussions that took place today?
Well, basically, the highlight, I would say, would center around, trying to assure, especially local manufacturers and traders here, that there would be enforcement of the agreements, because basically that is what the manufacturers and local-based trade organizations that attended this forum now, that's what they basically came to the forum with. They wanted assurances that the rules would be enforced, that they would be protected, that Nigeria was not going to be used as a dumping ground now for other products, especially products now that would be coming from outside of the continent. And for most of them, they cited, for instance, the border closure as one clear example now to back up their point, because basic reason why Nigeria decided to close the border, Nigeria has come out to say it's just because its neighbors, like Benin Republic, for instance, refused to enforce the ECOWAS protocol. And so for this manufacturers now, the should I say deliberate act now of flouting the ECOWAS protocol is a clear pointer that if certain steps were not taken, then there's just no guarantee that the agreement, the rules now of the AfCFTA would be enforced. So basically, they got assurances from, of course, those who were there that, that those rules now would be enforced. So basically, those are the highlights. And at the end of the day, of course, they came out with a communique that, look, they support the AfCFTA, they support the initiative, but of course, they're asking that, all the rules are clearly spelled out, not just spelled out, but to ensure that the rules are enforced and to ensure that every party to the agreement now keeps to the faith and spirit of the agreement, to ensure, especially, they kept harping on this issue of dumping now, that goods produced outside of the continent do not benefit from the AfCFTA.
Well, as you said, Deji, the private sector did have quite a number of issues with the CFTA. One of them, of course, from the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria was the fact that joining the CFTA would also result in an import surge over the next 15 years. That, of course, these concerns played a key role in delaying Nigeria signing off on the CFTA deal. Give me a sense of the attitude from the private sector now. Is it changing in Nigeria to the CFTA?
Yes, I think so, Uche. Absolutely. It's changing, it's evolving because, look, basically, the majority of them who attended basically said, look, even the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria that represents domestic manufacturers in this country came out to say it has nothing against the CFTA. That it's a very beautiful initiative. Gives you access to a very large market, a potential market, potential market of 1.2 billion people. What they're basically asking for is protection, and with the assurances that we see coming from this forum, with better explanation from some experts. They are now evolving. They are changing their views. They are changing their opinions. They are now for it. Besides, the Nigerian government has come out fully to give them the assurance that it would stand by them. It would ensure that the letter and spirit of the agreements are followed through. That it will protect them. It would ensure that they are not shortchanged. So we're beginning to see views are beginning to evolve, so to speak, and. Somehow, I think the local manufacturers here have embraced it on the basis of those assurances now that they have received so far. But then consultations are still ongoing, Uche. Consultations are still ongoing. Do not forget, Nigeria is yet to ratify it. Nigeria, of course, has signed up to it, but Nigeria is yet to ratify the AFCTA. So consultations are still ongoing. But the manufacturers are now beginning to embrace it, that they're basically open to the idea. Because they also know that, they need to play in this 1.2 billion people's market, so to speak. It's a huge market. And so they're evolving, let me just put it that way. They are embracing it, and I think going forward, they'll eventually accept it.
Well, in reality, Deji, it's not just about the private sector. One of the biggest obstacles to implementing the CFTA will be the national political dynamic as well as the national policy going forward. For example, in Nigeria, we saw, as we mentioned, recent border closures, and that raised questions about issues like cross-border tension, smuggling, as well as tariff and trade rules going forward. How is Nigeria's government approaching this, and what was the discussion around what we expect from the government going forward?
Well, the government, the government representative at the forum made it quite clear that, look, the border closure should not be seen as, should not be taken to mean that is exactly what we're going to see with the AFCTA. The government made it quite clear. The government put forward compelling reasons why it decided to close the border. And I told you that, for instance, Benin was not enforcing the ECOWAS protocol. Benin was allowing, different products from all over the world to come into its country, and most of those products at the end of the day end up here. They were not following the protocol now, for instance, to check these products, to escort the products to the borders and then hand over to the Nigerian customs at the border. So basically, the Nigerian government made it clear that, look, if everyone followed through with the agreement, the spirit of the agreement, that there wouldn't be any issue at all. So the Nigerian government has actually embraced the AFCTA. Do not also forget, Uche, that Nigeria is actually one of the chief promoters of these initiatives. So it just wouldn't make sense for it to back down. What I think Nigeria is trying to do is to protect the interest of its own interest, the interest of its manufacturers, the interest of its traders. And it came clearly, from all the contributions now of government representatives here that they would ensure that, for instance, smuggling will be checked. They harped on the issue of the rules of origin, for instance, to ensure that products that are coming from outside of the continent do not benefit from, the free tariff that products made in the continent would benefit from as a result of the CFTA. So basically, that's the position of the Nigerian government, and it's the reason why these local manufacturers have sort of embraced the idea, believing that the government would protect them when the time comes, and that the government would do the right thing to ensure that every other party to the agreement complies. Because these people, look, Nigeria is a huge market. We know the potential of the Nigerian market. And for some of these manufacturers, they just believe, look, Nigeria is basically the target for dumping and all of that. So what they are just trying to do is to safeguard their interest, to make sure nobody takes advantage of the CFTA to begin to push in, goods into the country, especially goods that can be produced here anyway, and to ensure that goods that are outside of the continent do not benefit from the CFTA agreement.
Right. Well, many thanks, Deji, as always, for your insights there. Deji Badmus joining us there in Lagos. Well, let's stay in Nigeria. A new World Bank economic report predicts that the country may be heading towards another economic recession. This, of course, is due to the volatile global oil market as well as dwindling price of crude oil. And this, of course, is coming just 3 years after the country edged out of its worst economic meltdown in nearly 3 decades. CGTN's Kelechi Mekalam tells us how this will impact the nation.
Worrying predictions coming from the World Bank. Nigeria may be on the brink of yet another recession as oil prices fluctuate between $63 and $55 per barrel. The World Bank, in its 2019 economic report, has said if crude oil prices plunge by as much as 25% to $50 per barrel, it would significantly reduce economic growth and lead to another recession. Just 3 years back, Nigeria was hit by its worst recession in nearly 3 decades, with about 50% of its 200 million population living below poverty line. Another recession would have a devastating impact on the country and its people.
Another recession will mean that poverty rate that is already high. That same report said Nigeria will house 25% of global poor people in no time. It will mean that more poverty. It will mean that a lot of things Nigeria wants in terms of GDP that Nigeria will not be able to do. It will mean more unemployment. It's not really going to spell out. We cannot put our heads around it. You saw what happened to Naira to global currencies, particularly Naira to dollar, which was as high as over 500. It's a major thing we need to guide against.
Crude oil is Nigeria's mainstay, accounting for about 90% of export earnings and over 60% of government revenue. Government has made diversification efforts from its oil-dependent economy, vying into sectors like agriculture, services and mining. Experts advise on major reforms to avoid another economic downturn.
What we need to do is reform. If we want to go on reform in manufacturing, we should go on reform on that. Power supply, it should be a major reform. If we're borrowing money, it should go directly into infrastructure. And one of the way the world can see that we are serious about this, every single kobo generated from crude oil should be invested directly in infrastructure. Capital expenditure, not administrative capital expenditure.
Nigeria's growth has remained relatively slow since edging out of recession. The non-oil sector still lags behind, with 1.6% and 2.6% growth in the first and second quarter of 2019, respectively. Aside looking to other sectors, there have been cutbacks on government spendings and actions to increase its tax base, although not enough. Now, authorities would be looking towards focusing on policies that would avert a looming recession. Kelechi Mekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Well, let's head to South Africa now. The country's national carrier, South African Airways, has been placed under business rescue. But can the struggling airline actually be rescued? While many welcome the president's decision to place SAA into voluntary rescue, some are still concerned it's not the answer to saving this airline that was once Africa's best. Here's CGTN Sumitra Naidu examining that question.
Les Mattison has been appointed as business rescue practitioner for SAA. He has over 35 years' experience in the business and is known for getting companies back on track. The process can be carried out in a few different ways. Mattison has yet to confirm the plan of action.
What essentially will happen is he will consult with the stakeholders. He will try to find finance, and then his main role is to set up a business rescue plan, and he will then, that plan is to be voted on by creditors and shareholders in a business rescue adoption meeting. If it is approved, then the business rescue practitioner will proceed to implement the plan.
Option one is just an immediate shutdown where you simply close all your doors. The second option is to then undertake what we call a liquidation process. And in the liquidation process, you then just sum up all your assets, you sell them, convert them to cash, and pay whoever you can pay. And whoever doesn't get paid, well, that's the end of the journey for them.
SAA owes money to a number of companies, including the banks. Its debt is in the region of $1.5 billion. But under business rescue, creditors will have to wait. Employees too.
The most significant effect is the moratorium on the claims of creditors. And what that means is that creditors can't enforce their claims against SAA at the moment or for the duration of the business rescue. Employees will still be expected to fulfill their duties, but their salaries, like every other creditor, is not enforceable at this point. During the business rescue.
Mattison has a strong track record, but saving an airline is complex.
People that have bought tickets are probably not at risk. The problem, unfortunately, is that people are now going to not buy the tickets. One of the possibilities is that it'll never fly again. It becomes difficult for you to buy your long-term tickets. So business rescue practitioner is working into a business where there are no revenues that are going to be coming in. So it's a matter of him trying to manage the costs. And once you manage the costs, ask yourself the question, how do I convince people to start buying tickets in this airline again?
Companies, they are often placed too late into business rescue, and the business rescue practitioner can only work with what he's been introduced to. And so what should ideally happen is that as soon as the company becomes financially distressed, it is placed in business rescue, but that is not always the case. And that often has a detrimental effect on the business rescue process.
Not every company gets saved under business rescue. Only time will tell with SAA. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
And now here's a look at some other corporate headlines today. Many South Africans could be without electricity this weekend if the rain continues. Now, power utility Eskom announced that it will cut up to 4,000 megawatts of power as wet weather makes it difficult for power stations to use coal. Coal handling problems have led to generating units being unable to produce power. Meanwhile, Uber has launched in Côte d'Ivoire's commercial capital of Abidjan. The move is part of its expansion into the African market with low levels of car ownership and limited mass transport. The ride-hailing service is reportedly in talks with regulators in Senegal about launching services in their capital, Dakar. And the International Monetary Fund has approved a second portion of a $247 million loan to be paid to Angola. This is under its extended fund facility following a review of the Southern African oil producers' progress under the program. The fund originally approved the facility totaling $3.7 billion in December 2018 to help Angola manage twin budget and balance of payments crisis. And General Motors and South Korea's LG Chem are investing about $2.3 billion in order to set up an electric vehicle battery cell joint venture plant in Ohio. The plant will be one of the world's largest battery facilities. Construction is to begin in mid-2020 and will have an annual capacity of more than 30 gigawatt hours with the flexibility to expand. And that's a look at our corporate headlines. Well, we are heading into a quick break now, still to come on the show. UK authorities investigate Glencore over bribery. And Bona, daughter to the late former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, to execute his estate.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sudan. Hello, Naro.
This is how whole stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back. Now, South African-based global commodities trader Glencore is now being investigated for bribery by UK authorities. The move by the Serious Fraud Office adds to ongoing corruption probes that Glencore is currently facing in the US and Brazil, which of course have scared investors and shaken the company over the past 2 years. Well, let's get more insight from Angelo Coppola. He joins us now in Johannesburg. Angelo, always good to have you on the show. Now, what more do we know about Glencore's latest legal troubles, of course, involving bribery in the UK?
Well, the SFO, or the Serious Fraud Office, apparently cast its investigative net quite widely. The details of the probe are not public at the moment, but some have suggested that the probe is going to be vague, and that's for a good reason. We understand, of course, that the SFO is looking into suspicions of bribery, and this is where the core is by Glencore, its employees, agents, and associated persons. An analyst suggests that perhaps this is because this net's been cast so wide, this potentially raises the penalty level if the company is found guilty of those bribery allegations, or it reaches a settlement. So it's quite vague and wide on purpose, because they're trying to broaden that net to try and attract as much information as they can, so that they can actually prosecute or fine the company itself, which
Now, as we mentioned, Angelo, the company is already facing corruption probes in the US and Brazil as well. All this has been a major hit on the firm. So give us a sense of how this is impacting Glencore's operations right now.
Well, look, the Glencore business model is built purely on close relationships. This new investigation apparently raises questions about the commodity trading in some of the world's poorest countries. In fact, Glencore and other trading operations have established relationships with politically well-connected individuals in those countries where the commodities are based that they're looking for. They're dealing with agents who work on commission only, and to get those deals done, they need to secure those relationships quite tightly. And we're talking about commissions here, but that could be a euphemism for another word, such as bribes. The probes, of course, are now starting to shine a light on those operators in those countries and their connections. And it's the US investigations, though, that are probably the widest and going to have the most far-reaching implications, because sanctions could be imposed by US authorities and imposed on anyone or any entity who are found guilty of any corrupt practices when trading in US dollars. And that's where the catch is in terms of the US. In terms of what happens in the UK, we'll have to see how they implement any kind of sanction. Uche?
Well, what does this mean for the firm's investment case going forward? Because we did see its stock price falling about 8.6% on the back of this news to about 3-year lows. So how does this impact investor sentiment when it comes to Glencore's listing in London as well as South Africa?
Well, look, as an analyst says, the Glencore investment case is a complex one, especially for investors who are looking for returns and ethical returns. Regardless of those investigations, of course, the nature of its operations and the relationships that the company and its executive members have with countries and leaders past and present is where the issue is. And that's how it sources its commodities. So it's also very complicated in terms of the CEO's relationship with some of Africa's less salubrious, shall we call it, leaders. And that's the subject of other investigations and probes, but not as far-ranging what's happening in the US, Brazil, and in the UK. But the changing global priorities and the need for these so-called ethical investments may signal a change in investor sentiment and possibly appetite in this commodity trader and other commodity traders for that matter. And yet, despite the share price tanking like 8.5%, Glassenberg's net worth is still in the region of $4 billion. So he's not doing too much wrong at the moment, Uche.
Right. Well, we're certainly watching. We do have to leave it there. Many thanks, Angelo, for that update. Of course, Angelo Coppola joining us there in Johannesburg. Well, let's move on now to Zimbabwe, where the legal process of distributing the estate of Zimbabwe's late former president, Mugabe, has begun. This, of course, follows the appointment of his daughter, Bona, his eldest child, as the executor by the High Court on Thursday. Here's Farai Mwakutuya with more on that story.
Bona Mugabe Chikore will compile a list of Robert Mugabe's assets and liabilities. What's left over after that will be shared amongst his widow and children as per the country's inheritance laws, since the former leader did not leave a will.
There's no legal requirement to do that. Usually, if I may explain why a person would draft a will, it would actually so that he can avoid the distribution that is stipulated in the law, because the law stipulates for you and I, if we die without a will, this is how your estate will be divided. But if you don't want that, what you will do is you sign a will to say it is going to be divided the way I want it to be divided. So, you know, the comrade president was a lawyer himself. He had 2 law degrees that he earned, and he must have made a conscious decision to that effect, that let the law apply in the division of my estate.
Mugabe is believed to have left behind $10 million held in a local bank account and several properties, although the full details of his assets will be confirmed by the executor. His lawyer dismissed rumors that the late former president's wealth has been hidden or understated.
The family would know, for example, that I'm staying in this house. There was this home that we used to go to. There are his cars that were outside. There is his clothing and personal effects. They can do that. They can easily identify that. But if something were to crop up in the woodwork, it then will be included. But from all indications, that just doesn't exist. The former president was a person of very, very modest tastes, a very modest person. And the list that showed you there, even though it had some inaccuracies because it had added things that simply were not in his name, actually shows you that he was more concerned of other things other than personal property.
After Mugabe's death in September, it emerged his palatial blue roof residence in Harare was in the name of the ruling ZANU-PF party. President Emmerson Mnangagwa has promised the mansion's title will be transferred to the Mugabe family. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Meanwhile, South Sudan's government has fired back against a report by advocacy group The Sentry on corruption connected to the First Family. In September this year, the US-based group released a report known as The Taking of South Sudan, in quotes, which accused international companies of profiting from South Sudan's conflict. Here's CGTN's Patrick Oyet with the details.
The Sentry report accuses several multinational corporations of collusion with people and entities responsible for human rights abuses in South Sudan. It alleges that 7 immediate family members of President Salva Kiir partnered with Chinese Malaysian oil giants British tycoons a network of traders from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya and Uganda to siphon money from South Sudan, the Sentry urged the U.S. to update its sanctions designation criteria to include family members of politicians involved in corruption. It also called for corrupt officials to be blocked from accessing luxury goods and property abroad. The Sentry urged the U.S. to go after entire network of corruption officials, including international facilitators, and sound the alarm on corrupt real estate acquisition. However, President Kiir's office says the advocacy group relied mostly on media and United Nations reports.
The Sentry peddles lies to paint a misleading picture of the South Sudan experience with war and corruption, suggesting policies that are capable of perpetuating instability in the country.
The office of President Salva Kiir also says it is unclear what methodology the Sentry used to acquire the alleged evidence in the report. The U.S. advocacy group has always said it stands by its original findings. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
Now you're watching Global Business Africa. Let's take a quick break. Still to come. Protests over pension changes in France paralyze activity for a second day. And we look at biodegradable earphones and how they're saving the world from the tons of electronic waste every year.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what do you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Let's recap today's top headlines now. Several people are feared dead after suspected Al-Shabaab militants attacked a bus in the northern part of Kenya. According to local authorities, it is feared that most of the casualties were security officers returning to their workstations in the region. And still in Kenya, scores of people are feared trapped under rubble following collapse of a 6-story building in the capital, Nairobi. So far, at least 2 people have been confirmed dead. The ongoing rescue operation is being led by the military. Authorities warn that the death toll is likely to rise. And Mozambique continues to deal with the devastating aftermath of Cyclone Kenneth. In the Cabo Delgado province, residents face an additional threat, which is the rise of militant attacks in the region. Over the last 2 years, an estimated 65,000 people have fled violence. And the Prime Minister of Sudan is visiting the White House, marking the end of a week-long discussion with top officials in Washington. They've been discussing Sudan's transition to democracy. The State Department announced earlier in the week that it will elevate diplomatic ties with Sudan and exchange ambassadors for the first time in 23 years. And that's a recap of today's top headlines. Well, let's head to France now. The country faced its second day of walkouts over the country's planned pension reforms. Unions embarked on a nationwide strike on Thursday, aimed at forcing President Emmanuel Macron to abandon plans to overhaul the country's pension system. Now, the strike shut down transportation, forced most schools to close, left hospitals understaffed and basic government services unmet. Macron says he wants to simplify France's pension system, which comprises of more than 40 different plans with different retirement ages and benefits. However, for unions, the proposed pension overhaul would force millions of people to work longer or have less lucrative benefits.
I've rented a car because it's unsure whether I can get a train from Montpellier. I can get a train to Montpellier, but I don't think I can get a train from Montpellier to Narbonne, which is where my car is.
En transport en commun ou en Uber?
Normally I commute with public transportation or Uber, but today I chose this method because since there are no buses and I have to go to the other end of Paris, it is easier to move around.
Meanwhile, the European Union has backed plans for stronger supervision to curb money laundering. The move comes after a series of scandals about dirty money passing through European banks. Well, last year, the bloc experienced its most massive money laundering scandal. This was when it was revealed that $222 billion in suspicious payments were made between 2007 and 2015.
Numerous money laundering scandals across the EU. Commission reacted and came with concrete proposals to strengthen the role of European supervisory authorities, concretely European Banking Authority in the field of anti-money laundering, especially catering for situations when national competent authorities are not reacting in a timely or sufficient manner to the shortcomings in AML enforcement.
And moving on now, global shippers are being forced to implement reforms due to overcapacity issues. Otherwise, they risk going out of business. Well, our reporter Xia Cheng explains.
This is a trade show for the shipping industry. Shippers are not having the best time of their lives due to global trade frictions, economic slowdown, and overcapacity. That's why only the most value-added services will win, with the help of smart technology.
The engine generates data and transmits it to the control room with a data platform on deck. You can cross-analyze all the data to let the machine review the result and make logical assessments. That allow us to see problems with the boat that we could never find out before.
AI and data technologies could also help the ship to stay on course by analyzing and predicting the weather and ocean currents.
Big data can help pick the best route for us to save as much as 3% of fuel. That means saving millions of dollars a year.
Many Chinese shippers have their own designs that are different from the mainstream ships. Those companies are trying to take over a niche for higher market share. They hope that all these strategic changes in the shipping industry in China will help counter the global headwinds. Xia Cheng, CGTN.
And to climate matters now, driving around Germany in an old diesel car may not be so easy now. After getting the green light from the country's administrative court and the EU, more and more towns in the country and cities are banning these old diesel engines in order to protect the health and the environment. But not everyone is so happy with these changes, as our reporter Guy Henderson now reports.
Car-free Sunday in one of the homes of the German auto industry. Older diesel engines are already banned from Stuttgart city centre. And this autumn, tens of thousands of protesters hit the streets to call for all combustion engines to be next.
I think we can't just say no more diesel right away, because e-transport is not perfect. But we for sure have to move away very fast, because we're facing a climate crisis. We need to take action now. And it's not about just banning some cars from the streets. It's banning all or more cars from the streets.
As scientists warn of a climate emergency, consumers might be changing their travel habits. Still, diesel in Europe isn't dead yet.
There was a time when diesel engines were more widely viewed as part of the solution in terms of improving air quality, but Dieselgate has changed all of that. Still, while sales have plummeted, more than a third of new cars sold in Europe last year were diesel engines. And according to one study, more than 3/4 of those vehicles fitted with cheated devices are still on the road.
In fact, this year, a pro-diesel camp has emerged in Stuttgart, led by this man, Ioannis Sakaros. Amongst Sakaros' gripes is that those on lower incomes, often owning older cars, are being unfairly penalised by what is the world's first partial ban on diesel vehicles.
Are you in agreement with most of those protesters?
Yeah, we have to reduce the carbon, but it will be a big problem for us to cut down the cars which exists now. It needs just more time. Yeah. And if they knew this problem, they could handle it earlier. Why did they start now?
Diesel was supposed to help lower greenhouse gas emissions until non-fossil fuel technologies were more fully developed. It still could, say experts, at least in theory.
Today we have very clean diesel engines, however they are more expensive. Therefore they don't meet the customer's budget. The one point, and the second point is it's not possible to sell diesel engines and diesel cars, passenger cars outside Europe, because the whole world is now in a position that they say, okay, we don't want to have that technology. It's not possible to bring it to the US. It's not possible to bring it to China, because China is going to electric vehicles. Therefore, the job is closed for diesel. We will see that the diesel will go down and down and down in the next 10 years because it's too expensive.
In diesel's decline, just a snapshot of a much larger question in the climate debate. In the rush to save the planet, how to manage all those changes as fairly as possible.
Wir alle, wir müssen auf allen Ebenen
Di Henderson,
angreifen.
CGTN,
Mit
Stuttgart.
Demonstrationen, mit Gesprächen, überall.
And heading to Australia now, the city of Sydney is experiencing its longest and most widespread period of poor air quality on a record. Now, the dangerous conditions are the result of scores of bushfires, which are burning across the state, as well as dust from the ongoing drought. With more on this, here's our correspondent, Greg Navarro.
One of the reasons that people choose to move to Australia and this city is the clean, clear air that Australia normally has to offer. But Sydney has not been able to deliver on that selling point, with the city once again shrouded in a very thick smoke haze that's not only masking the skyline, but also presenting serious health risks. The smoke is coming from a ring of bushfires that have surrounded Sydney on a very large scale. Health officials are warning that the air quality here lately has been among the worst in the world, and its impacts are being felt beyond day-to-day life. Players, for example, at the Australian Open golf tournament being held here at the moment are struggling to see the ball on long drives, judge distances because of the smoke, and are dealing with stinging eyes and other health issues from some of the highest air pollution ever recorded in New South Wales. Children and people with respiratory conditions are being urged to stay indoors, and firefighters are battling nearly 100 bushfires just in this state alone. Some of them are massive as they continue to burn in the hot, dry, and often windy conditions. Meteorologists warn the only way to clear the air here is through rain, and lots of it. But that's something that has been in very, very short supply for a very long time. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
Now, it turns out that mushrooms and a whole lot of other microbes can produce materials that rival plastics and even leather. Now, there's a team of scientists and designers working on just that in Finland. Here's CGTN's Laura Walubango with a story of Corva headphones, a bioengineered a prototype that's worth listening to.
These might be the most groundbreaking headphones of all time, but not for the reasons you might expect. We're not talking about audio capabilities or Bluetooth functionality here, but rather what they're made of.
So we have hard plastics, like a bioplastic here. Then we have soft cushioning made from fungal foaming protein and cellulose. And then we have a fungal leather-like material covering the cushion parts.
In 2017, nearly 368 million headphones were sold worldwide. That means a ton of plastic, leather and synthetic leathers materials that rely heavily on non-renewable, non-biodegradable resources. However, for these Finnish researchers, the process is a little different. To start out, Korva's headband is made of bioplastic. To make bioplastic, the team uses plain old baker's yeast. Through a chemical process, they turn that yeast into a bioplastic substance. That substance gets 3D printed and hardened. On the other hand, the cushioned air cups are made from fungal proteins and other plant-based materials grown in the lab. Those materials then get injected right into this mold, and when they're dry, they look and feel just like foam.
What we have here is this leather-like material from fungi. And then the idea here is to then grow it in the lab, and then after a few days, this is the end result.
The headphones also require a mesh-like cover for the speakers.
Then a very exciting material is spider silk. Like we can make in the laboratory silk-like materials with microbes, and that we have here inside as a membrane in the headphones.
Well, for now, these headphones aren't commercially available just yet, but the hope here is to someday commercialize them into a unique and trendy product worth listening to. Laura Walubengo, CGTN.
Well, led by Saudi Arabia and Russia, oil producers have agreed to cut oil output by an extra 500,000 barrels per day in the first quarter of 2020. Well, what happens after that, however, is still not clear. Between them, members of the OPEC group produce at least 40% of the world's oil. The precise details on how the extra cuts will be distributed, however, are yet to be determined. Now, some OPEC ministers were concerned about slower global GDP growth cutting into their demand, and they had called for cuts that will last until the end of the second or fourth quarter of 2020. However, OPEC was already cutting output at a deeper level than agreed to, so analysts view this week's agreement as simply formalizing what was already happening.
Today, OPEC and non-OPEC wants to reaffirm that they're willing to continue to manage the market, maybe by officializing the level of production they have, which is lower than what their target is. So there's room for them to announce at least paper cuts and show that they're willing to manage this market next year, where everybody believes that we're going to have some surpluses.
And on that note, let's take a look at how commodities performed today. Oil prices steady today, but they're set for weekly gains ahead of that OPEC meeting. We saw Brent futures were down today, but are still set to rise about 1.5% on the week. Meanwhile, gold prices also headed for a weekly gain, with spot gold prices flat on the day. Traders say gold hasn't really found a direction right now, as of course it waits to hear the fate of the US-China trade and a US jobs report that could offer further insight on the state of the US economy. Well, let's take a quick break now. Coming up. Tunisian students use technology to help Kenyan sea turtles.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Now, in Tunisia, students held a hackathon where they used technology and artificial intelligence in order to help resolve environmental issues on the continent. Here's CGTN's Terry Wangari with this story.
Technology meets ecology. Tunisian students participated in an eco-friendly challenge called Hack for Earth. Participants were expected to work and help solve an actual environmental challenge with the aim of establishing solutions for the common good. This challenge, which was hosted on Zindi, a data science competition platform in Africa, is meant to help save sea turtles using artificial technology.
This event brings almost 55 participants together. Most of the participants are students and are passionate about science, data and artificial technology. In the 12 hours of the challenge, we are going to propose a solution using artificial technology to help a Kenyan association predict the number of sea turtles they can save every week.
My participation in this challenge today is motivated by a personal goal. Firstly, because this can help me in my education. Everything about data science and machine learning, this trending technology that is changing the world, is a powerful technology that we can use for humanitarian purposes.
The data will be used by the local ocean conservation as part of their bycatch release program, which saves turtles, tags them, and then releases them back into the ocean.
The challenge today is about using the data provided by a Kenyan association, which shows the numbers and the places of sea turtles that they saved in the past. We are going to use an AI algorithm to predict the numbers of sea turtles that they're going to save each week in the future.
This challenge was difficult because we did not have the target that we needed to predict. Because in supervised learning, we always have a target to predict. The problem was that we had to come up with a target using the data provided by the association. But also understanding the data was a little bit difficult. But to be honest, the mentors helped us a little.
The event was open to all university students and professionals with a passion for solving environmental problems using technology. The results of the challenge were published on the Zindi platform. Terry Wangari, CGTN.
Now, millions of bargain-obsessed South Africans have embraced Black Friday this year. According to reports, during the global shopping spree, total spend amounted to roughly $410 million. That's a 106% increase from the $198 million which was recorded last year. CGTN's Angelo Coppola explains.
Black Friday is big business and growing in parts of Africa. Analysts are suggesting huge jumps in online revenue growth, and South Africa was a case in point that could be measured.
The online transactions have grown. Online transactions grew by about 32%. And that's also quite a big number, although online is still small. So we processed 7 million transactions compared to last year's 5.2 million transactions, while about 500,000 of that were online transactions. That's about 7% of the total number.
This Black Friday was a good Black Friday. In South Africa, we can see overall growth of 73%. For the DPO growth, we saw an increase of more than 50% of all our online payments this Black Friday.
To put that into perspective in terms of actual value, BankServe data was informative, but the organization only tracks interbank transactions in South Africa, so the data is an indicator only. And also, direct transactions between banks and their customers aren't included.
We almost doubled the value of transactions that were processed, up to 6 billion rand, through the transactions processed by ourselves, Banks of Africa. The other big number that was quite interesting is the number of the percentage growth in the first kind of hour after midnight, which was a third more than it was last year at the same time. So it shows you that the consumers were kind of at the doors of retailers a lot more this year when the retailers opened.
The growth in e-commerce isn't limited to South Africa.
In East Africa, for example, we saw a growth of more than 50% during Black Friday. That means that more and more e-com players are now operational in these regions.
More technology and online solutions are seen as the drivers for growth in Black Friday sales continentally.
Mainly more technology, more solutions. One great example is online and secure EFT, which allows shoppers in South Africa to use the bank account and shop and pay online. That solution alone brings more and more transaction For example, during a Black Friday,
there was one transaction worth 10 million rand. And it was an international transaction, it was an international company, and it was a hospitality type transaction. But it was 10 million rands worth on one transaction. Another interesting number is around one card that did just over 80 transactions on the one day of Black Friday.
Despite a depressed economy, people on Black Friday spent huge amounts of money, perhaps money they didn't have. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Meanwhile, officials in Cape Town, South Africa say maintaining law and order in the city will be their main priority this festive season. They plan to be uncompromising in their crackdown on people who are breaking the law on the roads of the Western Cape province. Here's Renee Dale-Carm with more.
Launching the 2019-2020 festive season safety campaign for the Western Cape province, authorities said they were expecting a greater influx of visitors this year compared to the same time last year. They called on locals and visitors alike to help them recommit the Western Cape province to safety and security by making this one of the safest festive seasons so far.
We will be vigilant this festive season. We will make sure that we are visible on our roads. We've increased the number of police officers. Please don't drink and drive, because the chances of you getting caught are higher now. Secondly, wear your seatbelt. Thirdly, please drive within the speed limit. You will get to your destination. And fourthly, don't try and overtake 4 or 5 cars on a barrier line, because you are not only putting your life at risk, you are also putting the life of other motorists at risk.
When you come into the Western Cape, please be aware our roadblocks will be out there. We will be looking to catch you should you not be adhering to the rules. But I really hope that we don't catch you. You don't become that statistic of another person fined, or even worse, a fatal statistic or an accident.
And after a challenging year of fighting alarmingly high crime rates across South Africa, authorities here in the Western Cape are promising that anyone who breaks the law in the next few weeks will face dire consequences and a not-so-festive holiday season.
This festive season, the roads are going to be flooded with law enforcement officers. And I tell you, we're going to everywhere going to arrest any form of criminality. Road criminals who drink and drive, people who bring drugs into our province, you will be caught.
If you are above the limit, you will be apprehended right then and there. And you'll spend Christmas and New Year's behind bars.
Officials have praised the men and women in blue who will be required to go the extra mile this festive season to ensure that the Western Cape's safety campaign is a success. Renee Dale-Carm, CGTN, Paarl, near Cape Town, South Africa.
Well, before we go, let's check in on Africa's currencies today. South Africa's rand set for its second consecutive week of gains. Now, the rand and its emerging market peers have found some comfort in positive news on the US-China trade war. Meanwhile, Kenya's shilling extending its recent gains as well. It was supported by hard currency inflows from offshore investors who, of course, are buying government debt. All this amid tight local currency liquidity conditions in the country right now. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.